So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to AMFI's fourth webinar in 2021. My name is Mirjana Ašković, and I'm director of the Australian Neurofeedback Institute. AMFI was established in 2019 as a program of starts to provide neurofeedback, biofeedback, and quantitative EEG training and mentoring, and also to raise funds to continue to provide neurofeedback services to our clients, refugees and asylum seekers. I would like to thank Jay, who kindly accepted to deliver this webinar for us today. And I would like to thank you all for your donations to our program that will go into student fund to support neurofeedback field. I hope you will join us for our future trainings, and you can find more information on our website. Before we start, on behalf of ANFI, I would like to acknowledge traditional custodians of this land and to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Before we introduce our presenter officially, I would like also to know a little bit more, and I believe that Jay would like as well to know who is our audience. So we prepared a brief poll for you, just to get information of where you're coming from and your interest. So questions where you're joining from, in which industry you work. If you can just take a poll, and I will share information with Jay and all of you. And it looks like poll is not, oh yeah, okay. We have one person from Australia, two from Australia. So far, we have one participant from US.
And it wasn't me.
Majority of our participants are from mental health field. We have some from public health and from education and media.
Yeah, it grows back. So, and when people pay that much to shave it off, of course I'm going to grow it back. They've only reinforced the behavior. So, and I was glad to see it go to the student fund.
And we need to get it back. It's not with starts anymore. So next time at TANSA conference, we'll try to, bid for your head again. We need to get Jay back to our office.
Actually, I heard that they pasted my beard onto a wig head and auctioned that off the next year for $500. And I can't imagine anybody paying $500 for a ratty wig head with bad hair on it, Oh, well.
That was fun, Jay. I participated, but Jay said I'm not very good in beard shaving, so we had to ask someone else to do it. Okay, we will end the poll now. And share results with you. I don't know if you can see. Majority of people here today are from Australia, but we have from United States and Asia. We have someone from Japan. Majority of people are from mental health field. But we have interest from other fields as well. Good.
And if you get 20% of your attendees responding to a poll, that's actually a pretty good return. People are notoriously, not active in sharing. So It's
Yes.
not that big a surprise.
Thank you, everyone. So let me introduce Jay officially now. So Jay is QEEG Diplomate Emeritus, and he is recognized as one of the top leaders in the field of EEG and quantitative EEG. He has processed over 500,000 EEGs since 1972, and at least 500 for starts. He has served as a president of International Society for Neurofeedback and Research, and he was a board member and treasurer of the Association for Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback. He is also past president of Biofeedback Society of California, and he was first EEG technologist certified in QEEG in 1996. Jay, that's an amazing career.
Well, I'm old. What can you say? It's been a fun career, and I hope to stick around a few more years. So.
We hope to have you, Jay, because every time we hear from you, there is something that we didn't know that we learn, and we are so humbled to have you with us today.
Well, shall we get started? And I need to share my screen here. And we'll get to that EEG in a moment, but first we have a PowerPoint presentation. And I'll minimize the view of me. So today, basically the talk is about COVID, but it's not COVID in general. It's specifically about long haulers, people that have recovered, but they're not right. They have a long-standing, persistent problem. Quite a few of them describe it as a brain fog, a memory problem, a fuzziness to their perception, a lack of clarity, a subtle confusion. But however they describe it, it's a disturbed brain function, and we'll have to look at that. Given the fact that between a third and a half of everybody that's recovered has some longer-term symptom, it's a gigantic problem. Just in the USA, which hasn't been doing a great job of managing their COVID, obviously, we've got over 19 million people that have recovered, which means that we've got, millions of brand new patients that don't know what's wrong, and they don't know who we are, and they don't know that we know how to help. So it's a gigantic market for us to kind of penetrate with some knowledge about what we do, who we are, how to find us, and that we can help. Let's look at some of the detail on this. First of all, the ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2, is the mechanism for the spike to hook into us. That spike has to latch onto something, and the something it latches onto is this ACE2 receptor. Now, it's throughout the body. It'd be nice if it was just one organ. At first, they thought it was the lungs, but after a little bit, they found that it affected lots of systems. They find cardiomyopathy, the muscle of the heart, having pathology, liver, kidneys, obviously lung function, gastrointestinal. Some people have postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where they stand up and their heartbeat gets super fast. Quite often they pass out or get dizzy. And it can also affect the brain. And that's the one that we're particularly interested in. Other specialists will deal with the other systems, but we've got a major one to deal with. So ACE2, basically, where does it in the body? The endothelium, the inside of us, and also the inside of the arteries are where it dominantly is viewed as being present. However, it's also present in the brain. ACE2 is seen in glia, and the studies associated with that are posted below. So there's actually a way for it to enter the brain into the glia. Although it's not extremely common for the brain itself to have an infection of COVID, it's entirely possible. It does happen. And when it does happen, it's extremely serious. Most of those that have found brain infections with COVID have actually passed. It's not a good thing to catch it in the brain. So how does it get in there? Well, the olfactory bulb, which sits at the base of the frontal lobe, it's where your nose and your brain kind of hook up, where you can actually sense smells. And it's very common for people to lose the sense of smell, and that's usually the olfactory bulb and the glia right there at the olfactory bulb. Sometimes it goes up into the brain, but quite often it's just the loss of sense of smell. People report the loss of sense of taste as well, but it's usually the sense of smell that they've lost. If you can't smell things, you can't taste them very well either. It can also enter through the eyes, and it wasn't all that long after they started to treat COVID that they realized that the face shield to protect the eyes from contact is also extremely important. It's not just respiratory. And then obviously vascular. If it's in the body somewhere, it can enter the blood vessels, and the blood vessels go up into the brain. And although people talk about the blood-brain barrier and that the vasculature is, not likely to have something leak into the brain, it's not 100%. Some blood-brain barriers fail, but it's also possible to have a pure vascular problem that doesn't end up getting into the nervous system aspect of it, but just into the blood supply for the brain. We'll talk about that. So there's direct impacts on the brain, but there's also generalized effects. If you're not breathing well and your oxygen drops down below 80%, they put you on oxygen, but you're essentially hypoxic. And even when people are on oxygen, their oxygen level quite often stays low because their lungs are so inefficient at transferring directly into the blood. So hypoxia is a common generalized effect that can end up negatively impacting the brain. Obviously, becoming hypoxic can create problems for brain function. If the hypoxia is long enough, you'll end up suffering decreased intelligence. If you're doing IQ testing, hypoxia will knock quite a few points off your score. And it can also do immune inflammatory changes, the cytokine storm that they talk about. Cytokines have a particular kind, bradykinin, which is seen in nervous systems, and that ends up being a specific form of a cytokine that ends up being in brain activity. So they've actually looked at a fair number of inpatients. Now, inpatients a bit of a different thing than people that get it and don't go into the hospital. These are 82% of them had neurological manifestations, but they were inpatients, generally on ventilators. And their complaints of muscle pain, headaches, encephalopathies. A third of them had encephalopathies. Now, encephalopathy is a big word meaning there's something wrong inside your head. It doesn't really tell you what kind of encephalopathy, just that there's something not right inside your head. So the symptoms of the encephalopathy could be anything from confusion to people that were in a coma and couldn't regain consciousness due to the brain dysfunction. Some complained of dizziness, and then the obvious common complaint of the lack of sense of smell and lack of taste. And again, the percentages here are actually, I think, an underrepresentation. There are a very large number of people that have lost a sense of smell, and the percentage on that has gone way up as they started to study it. And not everybody that recovers is recovered. And 15% of the college athletes in Ohio. Ohio State University had a big study, and they found 15% of the athletes who had, quote, fully recovered when they actually studied them with an MRI, ended up identifying cardiomyopathy. And if you have cardiomyopathy and you're an athlete, you actually have a fairly significant chance of having an immediately fatal cardiac problem. And there have been some athletes that have passed because of cardiomyopathy. So, what kind of brain pathologies do we see when we actually look at specifically the brain, not the other systems? First of all, you can actually have a stroke, a cerebrovascular accident. And these are usually thrombotic, not a bleed, but a chunk or clot that floats up in and plugs the vessel. And if it's a large vessel, it's a stroke. But you can also have small vessel emboli. So we'll talk about those in a bit. You can have a direct viral, and by the way, large vessel stroke, you're going to have a slow focus in the area that has had the stroke. Depends upon where it is as to where you're going to see it. If you have a direct viral encephalopathy where the virus itself is in the brain, you see spindling excess beta in the area that has the virus itself. The virus ends up generating a spindling fast beta. And that's a classic viral encephalopathy. This is not the first virus to end up with something in the brain. So a viral encephalopathy, basically you're going to end up seeing spindling beta in the encephalopathy. Now, slow content is very common as well, but the virus, the location of the viral infection is generally seen with a spindling beta. Now, you can have an inflammatory encephalopathy where the bradykinin and cytokines have, the storm has happened, and you basically end up with inflammation, which has edema associated with it. When you see edema in the brain, it compresses the blood vessels. You can't swell out when you've got a skull on the outside. So that pressure compresses the things that can be compressed, which include your ventricles, but also the blood vessels. So you get EEGs slowing when you see the edema and inflammatory encephalopathy happening. If you have a small vessel microemboli with edema, it's not the same as a stroke. It's not a full, the entire area didn't lose blood flow. It's a very small piece of the area. It's a microemboli. And you're going to end up seeing the slow edge of alpha showing localized edema, because edema causes ischemia. If you create pressure, you're going to squeeze the blood vessel, causing ischemia. And obviously, cortical edema, just the swelling of the brain, is possible as well. So here you can see areas where the brain has had vascular damage in small vessels. This is not a large stroke. These are small vessels that have had small embolic infarcts for the small vessel. Now, there's no local COVID. The virus didn't infect the brain here. This is vascular change associated with the fact that the person had COVID, but this is not COVID in the brainstem. This is COVID causing small vascular events in the brain. Again, not a major stroke, small vessels. There's a difference between a large vessel emboli and a small vessel emboli. So, ischemia, basically an insufficient blood supply. So oxygen and glucose aren't being supported for actual full function. Generally, there's some flow. It's just not enough for full function. So you have a local decrease in perfusion, and the perfusion is the pressure that oxygen has in order to penetrate into the cell. So blood, oxygen, and glucose are supplied along the blood vessel, And if you have a major stroke, obviously a large area is going to be starved of oxygen and glucose, but a small vessel can end up being seen as well. Now, what do we see when we have small vessels? Not a stroke, but a small vessel having problems. Well, mid-temporal sharp slow transients. That basically, if you add a couple of different frequencies together and let them run, they're going to end up adding up and creating a sharp wave once in a while when you add the two waves together. And sometimes they'll subtract from each other and create slower frequency content. So when you see mid-temporal sharp slow transients, it's an indication that we've got an ischemic change. Now, these are non-specific. Now, irritative or ischemic, you can't say, oh, this person has ischemia when you see this. All you could say is that, something's not right. Could be irritative. That's more like epilepsy. Could be ischemic. That's the vascular issue. Most of them are ischemic. There's actually been a large study by Ernst Niedermeyer when he was still alive, over 200 subjects. And he took this non-specific finding and drilled down on individual cases as to what was really the problem. And they found migraine ischemia, post-traumatic ischemia, local vascular change like an arteriovenous malformation, that sort of thing. And they found local ischemia from that. And they also had inflammatory edema creating ischemia. So 80% plus of the subjects that they looked at had vascular problems. The other almost 20% had underlying epilepsy that just didn't have a fully formed discharge. So 80% probable we've got vascular issues when you see this. And here's the paper under clinical electroencephalography, 1987. It's an old paper, but then both Ernst is older than I am, and he ended his career. Finally, I'm still sputtering along near the 90 plus years that he had. Now, vascular, there are people that would say, well, cerebrovascular issues, the QEEG's not very specific, and the QEEG is not sensitive to these things and so forth, and kind of dismiss the use of EEG, QEEG to see cerebrovascular issues. After all, they have MRIs, they have PET scans, they have CT scans, they can look at the structure. Why would you look with the EEG? Well, this is from 1997. The original American Academy of Neurology position paper about QEEG. There's a section on cerebrovascular disease. And in that section, you'll notice that whereas everybody thinks that this paper is like anti-QEEG, it's not. So here's their caveat. When used by a skilled professional experienced in EEG interpretation, that's their caveat. Sensitivity and specificity are high for detection of ischemia-related cerebral impairment or similar focal impairment. Studies show sensitivities greater than 80%, good specificities, false positive rates below 5 to 10%, correlations greater than R of 0.7 between EEG and blood flow in ischemic and non-ischemic regions. Many were controlled, well-designed studies. Some were prospective and blinded, which showed the QEEG could detect reliable focal features that were missed on initial review of the routine EEG. And here I would agree that the QEEG is easier to spot the problem than the raw EEG is. But if you're really good at the raw EEG, you'll see it too. But it's easier if you see the Q. So these tests can be quite abnormal, even when the CT or MRI are still normal, such as the first few days after a stroke, or whether the ischemia associated with the stroke is mild enough to cause a dysfunction, but not an infarct. They go on to say that spatial localization is better with a CT or MRI, but the EEG, QEEG is better at seeing this stuff than other forms of testing, and the QEEG is even better than the raw EEG is. So that was 1997. Here in 2012, the Critical Care Medicine Journal did an invited review, which is like a position paper. And they basically approved the use of QEEG for identifying ischemia, tracking it in the hospital, and looking at responses to treatment. So the QEEG is basically well accepted in medicine for the use for looking at vascular ischemia. Now, this is a rather complicated chart, but let's kind of drill down on what we're looking at. First of all, this is perfusion, hyperperfusion, hypoperfusion. So the brain busy being on, the brain idled out. And we have a dotted line, that's 2 standard deviations, and a little dotted line, 3 standard deviations increase, and 2 and 3 decrease. The solid line here is statistical significance increase. The solid line below is statistical significance decrease. And obviously 0 is the mean perfusion. This didn't matter where it was. It's actually a perfusion measurement of the cortex wherever you're looking at the cortex. If it's increased perfusion, you're more likely to see, these kinds of things. And if you're hypoperfusion, you're more likely to see this. Now, the 3 separate lines, this is linked ears. Linked ears does not show local perfusion very well at all. It's the difference between a spot on your ear and a spot on the head. It's not just the spot on the head and the perfusion there. It's the difference. These are Laplacian techniques, local and global average. And both Laplacian techniques track local function quite accurately. Now, what do we have? Delta is actually a positive perfusion. When you're asleep and your brain is making slow waves of sleep, your brain is busy doing what it's supposed to do during sleep. Slow wave sleep, your brain is having your pituitary produce growth hormone. You're recovering from the wear and tear of the day at a cellular level. During REM sleep, you're actually playing back recollections of memory traces of the day. But the slow wave sleep is what's producing all of this. And again, delta is not, this isn't the faster you are, the more perfusion, the slower you are, the less perfusion. Delta is actually a positive perfusion. Theta frequencies from about 3 or 4 hertz on up to about 10 or 11 hertz are significantly hypoperfused, decreased perfusion. At about 10, 11 hertz, it goes into a neutral positive perfusion. This is an important aspect of this. These frequencies are above the mean, but they're not hyperperfusion. It's a gentle positive perfusion. And remember this, because if you're going to fix a blood vessel problem where there's ischemia and a decreased flow dynamic, you're going to have to turn the area on and leave it on for a while so that the brain opens up its own blood supply. The brain controls its own blood supply. If you use an area, the blood supply in that area will open up and you'll have an increase in perfusion. This was actually observed back in the 1800s, the 1875, where they identified that when you use an area of the brain, it goes electronegative and it becomes red. You actually increase perfusion in the area. So neutral positive perfusion, we're going to pink it up, and it tends to open up the blood vessels. If you create more demand than you have supply line to support, you actually create edema. You create hypoxia locally and local edema, and that's going to make the ischemia worse. So if we do gentle stimulation, we'll fix it. If we do too strong a stimulation, we're not only going to not fix it, you might actually create cell death. Now, that doesn't sound like a good outcome, does it? We hope not to have our clients, when we're trying to help them, have cell death. So we want to gently open up the blood vessel, not create a strong demand for supply. The reason that this resting state, gentle on, is desired is that we want to stimulate it, but gently. Now, what happens when you overstimulate it? Well, the same thing that happens if you have a concussion and you try to go back into the game or start to recover more fully right away. They tell you to rest. The reason that you need to rest is that your body has to recover to the extent that it can without overactivating it. If you create an active demand for function, you can actually, again, create cell death. Hypoxia leads to glutamate cascade. Glutamate cascade leads to cell death. So we want to be gentle in our stimulation. And at that point, we basically expect a fairly positive outcome. Now, this is all great stuff. Let's actually look at a little bit of EEG. This is somebody whose eyes are open and they're having working memory problems and headaches. You look at the EEG, it's occipital's at the bottom. Now, eyes are open, you don't have a bunch of alpha, but you start to look around and you see this and this and this. We've got alpha at FP1, F7, T3, a little bit on the right side as well, but largely this is alpha. But when I say it's alpha, it's a little loose on the definition. Some of this, a cycle and a half, doesn't quite fit. So there's probably some 7, 8, not just 8, 9, 10. And if we shift this to a map, there's maps here, but it comes from this data. This is that person's EEG cleaned up and broadcast up as a spectra. You can see at the back of the head we have some alpha. It's not the fastest alpha in the world, but when we map the more prominent peaks, you can see that there's some faster alpha here. There's a 10 hertz little tick down below it there. And you can see at 10 1/4 hertz, you get this left posterior temporal distribution. But if we go even slower, down to 8, the peak here is basically at just shy of 9 hertz, but that's the peak. And the edge of this actually drops down just below the traditional alpha band. The slow alpha that you see here is ischemia. Now, you can get ischemia from post-traumatic ischemia, migraine ischemia, COVID ischemia. Lots and lots of reasons to end up with vascular issues. And if somebody presents with a complaint of cognitive cloudiness after a surgery, after a COVID, after a head injury, it's time to take a look. And if you see the slow edge of alpha, it's time to act, because you want to gently stimulate it, not just let it sit there at the slow edge of alpha. And we don't want to overstimulate it. So let's see here. Let's get this EEG. So this is eyes open. This is somebody with brain fog and working memory problems with COVID. This is post-COVID. Now, you might notice there's eye blinks. There's a lateral eye movement. You see F7, F8 opposite polarity here. So there's lateral eye movement and blink, 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 blink. Now, traditional de-artifacting, you'd be cutting these out and throwing them away. And when they're happening that often, you kind of make your EEG into little tiny pieces. And that's no good. That this really needs to be cleaned up with modern de-artifacting, not with the old cut out the eye blinks you can see and throw them away, because in between the ones you can see are little ones that you can't see, lateral eye movement or saccadic eye movements. And saccadic eye movements are always happening. If your eyes don't move approximately once every 80 milliseconds or so, your rods and cones start to habituate to the input. So we have subtle involuntary twitches in our eye movements. And those small eye movement twitches are saccadic eye movements. They happen about 80 milliseconds, roughly. Well, that's faster than alpha. So, where are they? Well, you can't see them separate from the EEG because they blend into the background EEG. And when we used to cut out big pieces and throw away the big eye blinks we could see, the small saccadic eye movements that were left over were perfectly acceptable because that's the best technology we had. now we have technologies that are able to actually take out the big eye blinks and the lateral eye movements and include the little tiny twitches of eye movements. So here's a long stretch and it looks pretty good, but there's a lateral eye movement here and a lateral eye movement here. So again, you'd end up having pieces missing. So, we've got to cut this one up or extract the signal. So we can extract the signal of the eye movements here with ICA. I have to move this out of the way to get to that. So we have ICA or PCA. PCA only works with Gaussian distributions, and the EEG is not Gaussian, but some people will call it Gaussian. Nobody would argue that that artifacts are normal in their distribution. So we're going to do the ICA. It's learning the EEG. It's a machine learning algorithm. It just went through the EEG and figured out what everything is coming from. So independent sources, maximally separated. And as we go through the EEG, the number one components are automatically picked. And if we scroll in, you'll notice that the big eye blinks. Basically, let me slide this across until we get one in the center of the window. You can see the blink here. There's no alpha in the back. It goes up in the front, down in the back. There's little tiny movements, but those are small saccadic eye movements. And here, going back a little bit in time, we see that there's still lateral eye movements in the EEG. This is raw EEG. These are components that we think are artifact, and this is the EEG minus the components we think are artifact. So we have to drop down through the list and see where the lateral eye movements are. Left and right are out of phase. So red and blue are phase. You can see the waveform, the little dippy things here. I'm going to select this, and surprise, the lateral eye movements are now in the de-artifacting window. They're taken out of the EEG. So this is the EEG minus vertical and lateral eye movement. Vertical and lateral. Dropping down the list, that's basically the only components that we have that are frequent artifacts in this. It's a pretty clean EEG. There are people that take out muscle. It can come out, but I generally don't, because muscle can also take out EEG sometimes. It'll take out localized beta. So I'd rather read around the problems of muscle and take out episodes, which we can cut out. The rare movement of EMG that's still present in the EEG can be cut out. And there might be something like a little electrode pop left. And sometimes electrode pops come out. But again, this is temporal, and it would also be pulling out EMG. So I'm going to leave it in. I'll cut out the artifact. I'm going to say OK and accept the de-artifacting with blink and lateral, and just those two. At this point, the EEG has a little low-grade EMG in the temporal areas. And as we scroll through, we'll perhaps spot the moments in it that had artifact. But here's that little electrode pop, and we could manually grab it like this and snip it. If we snip it, it should be underlined in blue. I gotta get this out of the way. There we go. And at that point, it won't be analyzed. Now, it also allows us to erase the piece, but it warns you. Are you sure you want to erase something? Because if you erase this piece and it ever goes to MedLegal, the argument on the other side of the bench will be that this piece contained the evidence that they needed to prove their case. And if I click on this, it'll erase it. And I can show you that just to show you how bad it is. It tells you there's 2 seconds missing. And that's where and I can't ever get it back. This is where they will say, oh, well, that's where the XYZ wave was that proved that our client was guilty or innocent, whichever side they're on. So this has to have other moments that are muscly or movementy. And rather than go through and do them all manually, we can also do it in a more automated way. This is a mark artifact. I match the size of this signal. This is the sensitivity. It's labeled gain, but it's actually sensitivity, how many microvolts there are in a centimeter. And I usually cut that in half or more sensitive. Half of that would be 75, more sensitive than that. 35 is more sensitive. We'll leave it at that. And 10% would usually be it, but it's pretty clean except for the little bits of EMG. I'm going to go for 12 microvolts and between 30 and 50 hertz, and we'll see if that catches the pieces. Caught that, didn't catch this. The sensitivity of the muscle or the slow wave wasn't enough, and we'll go to 30 and we'll go to 10. Try to sneak up on it here. Caught that, didn't quite catch this. The muscle can be a little more sensitive. And a couple more microvolts worth. That got it. Little tiny bit of muscle. But it's got 4-second long pieces in between the pieces that it's taking out. Nothing is perfect. You know, you could argue, well, there's a little wiggle here that's not quite right. But quite honestly, if that little wiggle stays in and we've got all this clean EEG, it's going to wash out. So this is going to show us on the average what we've got for frequency content. We're going to run the spectra on what we see here. The full file, I'm using a 4-second epoch to give us quarter hertz resolution. Here we are. I'm going to create classic bandwidths. Yellow is the classic definition of alpha from 8 to 12. You'll notice that the alpha peak, I mean, who's going to complain about a 9 hertz alpha peak? That's not too slow, but it's not the only peak in town. Obviously, we've got a red peak here outside the alpha band and outside the alpha band here. And up front, you can see the slow edge of alpha sticking into the theta band. The slow edge of alpha tracks ischemia. Comprehension and memory happen in the temporal areas. The complaint about, you know, not being very sharp with respect to memory and especially language and word finding is explained by the slow edge of alpha here. And the slow edge of alpha is intense in the temporal areas. Now, what brain structure sits in the temporal areas that is going to create this much hypoperfusion? Well, your hippocampus and amygdala are major users of blood flow. They have their own blood supply. The posterior communicating artery ends up being a direct supply to the hippocampus through your vertebrobasilar arteries. And they burn up a whole bunch of calories, and when they have a decreased flow and you still are burning calories, you're going to end up with hypoxia, which creates edema, which creates this. So whether this was created from a global inflammatory thing and the hippocampus amygdala were active enough to create hypoxia locally, or whether it was a local microemboli floating in and clogging up vasculature. We can't say how this came about, but we can say where it is and how to fix it. We have to do SMR type frequency training. Now, we could train 12 to 15 hertz here, but at the same time, we could do CZ to the temporal, and that SMR-like frequency here is actually SMR, and here it's fast alpha, but we have the effect that we're looking for. And CZ to the left temporal, CZ to the right temporal can be done with a 1 or 2 channel device. You don't have to do all 19 channels at once. Some people will target the slow edge of alpha as an excess feature and target it with more channels. There isn't a hard, this is the protocol that works. There's probably lots of ways to create a proper protocol going forward. We've got people that are raising hands and have questions. Feel free to pop up a question and actually ask it at this point. I'd hate to have a question that's answered by this screen kind of slide by. Anyway.
Jay, it would be interesting to see how we can choose whether we will train CZ, P7 or maybe P7, P8. Can you show us how you can choose what would give us a better signal?
Sure. One of the things that we can do, I'm going to minimize this particular screen and go back to the raw EEG. One of the nice things about the software, let's say we're thinking that the P7 was language area and their difficulty with language is what we were going to work on, so we were going to try and focus on that. Well, that's this electrode. But, there's lots of electrode combinations we could do. This software allows us to look at the montage that we're dealing with. We can add a channel, and the channel we add can end up being created that this, remember I suggested CZ to P7. So P7 is the same as T5, modified nomenclature is all. So that's going to show us that channel. You might have somebody else that says, well, that's not the perfect montage. And you ask them for their recommendations, so they come up with a different combination. That's entirely possible. I mean, if you ask 4 people, you get 6 answers, and you can plug a bunch of channels in here and actually test to see which one looks like it's more likely to work. So, let's say we asked somebody else and they said, what we want to do is the T7 to linked ears. And you ask somebody else, and they said, "Oh well, they're all wrong. T7 to T8." Yeah, and you can imagine stacking up a whole bunch of suggestions. Everybody's got their opinion. There's only one expert. Your client's brain is the only expert on your client's brain. Every theoretical approach is theoretical until it runs into your client's brain. So we can see that the sensitivity or gain setting is at 50 for these and 150 for everything else. So we're going to have to reset that. The filters, this is at 30 hertz. We want to go up to 50 to see the entire spectra. And this is at 45, 55. So I'm going to say, rather than reset all of these in little tiny windows, I'm going to say, okay. At that point, I know I have to go to all of these to 50, all of these to 60 hertz, and all of these to 150. So here we are. CZ to P7 shows the irregularity at P7 pretty well. The linked ears doesn't, but think about it. You have an electrode right next to an ear electrode. It doesn't have a good inter-electrode distance, and it doesn't really show things nearly as well as the other 2 channels do. But the CZ P7 here looks like it's locking onto the signal that's coming out of the P7 pretty well. In fact, it's bigger than the P7 to the average montage up there. CZ P7 shows it even more significantly. So yeah, punch in any montage you can come up with, because try it. You never know what combination is going to end up looking like it works really well. And at that point, you can scroll through the EEG and see which one of those channels looks like it's modulating along with the P7 irregularity. So, test, trust but verify, as they say. And, you got to be wondering if you're trusting me. You should actually look for the data. If I tell you something about the EEG, you should be able to ask for the reference. Don't just do blind faith. Blind faith doesn't work very well for me. So, please ask for reference material or where I got the opinion from. And unless I can actually point to something, with real experience of some sort, I'm going to have to show it to you in the raw waveforms in order for you to believe it, if it's not already published somewhere. But you can see, I think the T7, T8 kind of halfway picks these stuff up, but T7 to linked ears is really a mistake. So trust but verify, punch in your montage under a view, select montage, create whatever montage you wish to have. So anyway, that's a quick run through on the EEG. And at this point, we've gone just about an hour. We're about 9 minutes short of an hour. So I was a little faster today than it was last time going through this, but we've got time for questions. And
you can post your question in chat. I'm not sure if you can ask directly, but you can post it in chat. While we are
okay.
In questions and answers also.
I don't know where they're going to pop up, but at least on chat, I'll see it.
While we are waiting, you mentioned this morning, Jay, that there are other, apart from neurofeedback, there are other neuromodulation techniques that can be used to work on those who had COVID-19 and have lingering neurological problems. Can you tell us a little bit more? What else?
I'm having some trouble hearing. Your voice broke up some. Can you repeat? I'm sorry.
This morning you mentioned that there are other ways of helping those who had COVID and now have neurological problems. What else we can use?
Sure. Hypoxia and anoxia are problems basically with oxygen delivery. If you go into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, especially if they're a good one, a hard chamber, not a soft chamber, using oxygen, not room air. And a soft chamber, you're not supposed to use oxygen because of the fire hazard, but a hard chamber, is you can use oxygen. At that point, oxygen actually transfers directly cell to cell to cell. That doesn't have to go through the blood vessel to get to the end point. It can transfer directly through tissue. And hyperbaric oxygen will get oxygen through past the ischemia blockage, actually directly into the tissue, and that helps with recovery. Anytime you have an ischemic injury, hyperbaric, especially if it's soon, ends up being a very good answer. The other thing that we found is that photobiomodulation seems to have the ability to stimulate the area. There are other people that have started to use the pulsed EMF and other forms of direct stimulation. I have to say that unless you do a gentle stimulation, you're overdoing it, and you have to be gentle in what you're doing. You can't go in with a big TMS magnet, a gigantic magnet that creates huge fields. That's too much power. You're going to have an influence on the brain, but you're going to overdo it. So it's time to back away from more powerful technologies and use a softer touch. And again, photobiomodulation isn't quite as powerful as a 1.5 to 3 Tesla magnet would be. Pulsed EMF is much weaker. It can be done gently, but again, you want to be easy on what you're working on. So if somebody is starting to have a headache, you've pushed the ischemia to the point where it's symptomatic. If they feel pressure, you're pushing it too hard. Back off on how hard you're training. Shorten up the sessions. If you're doing 12 to 15 hertz training, remember that curve on the upper edge of it, it went up towards hyperperfusion. If you back down the tuning from 12 to 14 to 12 to 15 down to 11 to 14, you've moved away from the increased perfusion towards the lower perfusion. So you can back off on how much activation you're requiring from the stimulation as well. So be gentle, shorten your sessions, and down tune your SMR if you're having a side effect from the traditional SMR training. You can, again, slightly slow a half a cycle or a cycle a second slower, and you decrease the amount of perfusion that you're demanding with the training. You have to be easy on brains that have been damaged, and your training has to be gentle. To the extent that you think of the training as no pain, no gain, you're causing problems. So, can you identify COVID-caused ischemia from other kinds of ischemia? No. Post-traumatic ischemia, migraine ischemia, it's hard to identify. Now, migraine ischemia is normally bilateral, posterior temporal, T5, T6, right there. You saw this COVID case was T5, T6. Now, I couldn't have said that it wasn't migraine, except that this particular case, we actually had a prior EEG on him. This is a brand new peak. We also have post training and post photobiomodulation on him, and that slow peak is attenuated. So, but that's basically, you can't differentiate one kind of ischemia from the next, but when you see ischemia, you know how to treat it. Protocols to stimulate the immune system. I wish I had an easy tap into the immune system to back off how aggressive the immune system can be, because autoimmune issues end up happening in some people. I really don't have a direct immune system itself protocol. There are people that have protocols that are anti-inflammatory protocols using pulse TMF, but that's a different technology. And sorry, I didn't have a more solid answer on that, but protocols that stimulate immune system, again, I can't turn on and off immune system with EEG that I know of. The brain does end up having receptors for the immune system's activity. The hippocampus has leukocyte receptors, and if your immune system is kicked in, you actually have a response in the brain. You can actually see about a day or two ahead of a lupus reoccurrence that it's about to happen. You see a frontocentral big theta hotspot emerge, and again, it's usually a day or so ahead of time before the rash and that sort of thing end up popping back in. There's three kinds of montages. Why do you think that all montage spectral trend lines converge in the alpha range? Well, all montages are going to show all activity that's in the montage. It's not just alpha. The signal that we're looking at the bottom here has alpha in it. You'll see that there's phase differences between them based on how they're laid out, but can audiovisual entrainment help treat ischemia? It's possible. It's not one that I've worked with specifically. The difficulty with a photic stimulation or auditory stimulation that creates a wave is that it's a different mechanism for creating a wave. You're creating a standing potential using essentially an event-related potential. It's not the same as a spontaneously generated rhythm. If you flicker something at 10 hertz, you get a 10 hertz waveform at the back of the head, but it's not the same generator that ends up generating 10 hertz alpha in the back of your head. It's basically just a relay of the event-related potential. And all frequencies that were present in these electrodes are present in these bottom channels. And again, you see these pointing towards each other. That's the phase CZ to P7 versus the intertemporal. If I put the P7, actually I got a P7. It could have been a T7 there. My apologies for punching in things a bit here, but the waveforms are inverted because of the layout. The temporal is in the second channel here, the second grid. There's 2 inputs to every channel. Can I add a channel that's P7 to REF? I probably can. Add P7, my error earlier, and reference. And again, we're going to have to reset the size here. I'm going to say OK. And 150, 50, and 60. So here's P7 to linked ears. It's not that bad a choice, but you can see it doesn't really quite catch some of the features quite as well. It picks up a parietal rhythmicity here, but that's steady rhythm instead of the modulation. Sure, my pleasure to help. So we've gone just a little bit over an hour. I'm happy to take questions or comments, and I guess it's go to webinar, and those aren't always that easy to end up having everybody unmuted and chatting. So,
Jay, what about supplements? Although that's not your area.
Not my area of specialty, but there are lots of people that are trying lots of supplements, and I have yet to find anybody who's got kind of the one that makes it kind of all work. So if somebody's got a supplement that works, they should start to advertise around to folks that they've got something that works. I do know that there are people that have tried B vitamin complexes, but hadn't really, it didn't have the kind of an effect that they were looking for. Probably didn't hurt, but it didn't have the dramatic positive clinical impact. B vitamins are useful for enhancing metabolic function, but they don't necessarily in and of themselves do vasodilation for an area that's got ischemic change. There are people that suggest exercise, but if you talk to anybody that's got post-COVID brain fog and chronic fatigue kind of symptoms, they have usually a very negative response to trying to do major exercise kind of things. Again, if you overtax the brain, you're going to actually make the situation worse. you create enough hypoxia from overworking the area, and you can actually create cell death and make your situation a lot worse. So resting is what they recommend initially, and then bringing people back into full function very, very slowly. Okay, let me scroll back and see this one. Okay, we talk about montages, but what about a training condition? Increase amplitude or frequency or other. We're basically trying to train up the power or amplitude within the SMR band. Again, it's a neutral positive perfusion. We're generally trying to suppress the alpha frequency that we're seeing there and any slow content that might be present. And we're definitely not trying to make big beta happen in the area. If you have beta in the area, you're going to want to suppress that as well. Okay. The question about what photobiomodulation, the one that I've seen work with this was not one of the commercial devices. It's a startup company that's working on it. It's functionally very similar to the Violite and the Violite Gamma, not the Violite Alpha. And there's a difference with photobiomodulation, and it's the brain is a passive recipient. It doesn't really have a task as much as it's just being stimulated by it. So I haven't seen that the gamma was overactivating and the alpha would be a better one or anything. The gamma is what seemed to work. And there's a lot of photobiomodulation stuff coming out. The technology is very inexpensive to create. If you're following the group in South Korea, they actually have what looks kind of like a bicycle helmet sort of a structure, but it actually can expand and get bigger and smaller. As you make it expand, the electrodes move away from each other, so the size remains 1020 compliant. And each of the electrode sites are spring loaded, and they have little kind of fingers that stick out, so it goes through hair. And they've done a very nice job of it, and each of the electrode sites has a photobiomodulation in the center of it. So you can measure EEG with it, and you can also do photobiomodulation. And they expect to have that available for the initial user groups by April. They've been showing it at meetings, but they've got a production run that's going to be available in April. So we've got a handful of folks that are researchers that are probably going to get some of those. Anyway, looks like we're running low on questions, and we've not done 90 minutes, but we're a little over an hour. I don't want to cut anybody off if you got a question.
While we are waiting for a question, if anyone else has to ask, I would like, Jay, to thank you for being with STARS for many, many years. You've been our mentor and also consultant. And I really believe that for the whole field of neurofeedback, you gave us so much and improved on the way how we think about neurofeedback training. We have tools that we can use now. And that's really, there is not enough to thank you for your contribution to the whole field.
Well, thanking me just makes me uncomfortable. So you've already done way more than enough. I can take grief more easily than I take thanks. So difference between sharp alpha transients bilaterally versus one side. If you see it on one side, at least you know which side you should be working on. The sharp spiky alpha or sharp transients, sharp and slow content that end up being seen in the temporal areas are what you're basically looking for. And as you scroll through, again, we've got a handful of channels at the bottom. Let me turn these off so they're not kind of taking up room. As you go through this, first of all, you can see sharper morphology and slower morphology in the area. It's not really dramatic, but at the same time, if you're used to seeing nice smooth alpha and you run into transient irregular waveforms, you've got a pretty good idea that you're looking at a change in the area. One of the nice things here is the ability to actually move the channels up to see whether they're sharing the same content. And again, you see an irregular thing in the temporal area, one side more than the other. You can pull this up and superimpose it. Sharp and slow transients. Again, not just sinusoidal smooth alpha, but sharper and slower content like this. And again, when you see sharper and slower content like this, you assume that what you've got is actually a blending of frequencies. This is an ongoing waveform. Sometimes what looks like a slow wave actually has two waves in it, and this wave actually has multiple waves in it. So mid-temporal sharp slow transients end up having some situations that are much more dramatic than what you see in this raw waveform itself. In fact, I think in the PowerPoint, this is fairly easily seen as a sharp slow transient in the temporal area. And this is pretty much one side only, left frontotemporal. So.
And the question, Jay, is what is or where is the source if it's unilateral or bilateral?
Usually you've got the vasculature in the area. This particular one that you see here, FP1, F7, T3, or T7, if you're new nomenclature, basically that's the middle cerebral artery distribution. If you get posterior temporal, it's usually the vertebrobasilar and posterior communicating artery distribution. So it's vascular, and it's the cortical area that vasculature supports, and the ischemia gives you the sharp and slow transients. So the sharp slow transients are because of cortical ischemia, and it's a thalamic-cortical thalamic rhythm. And with that loop having a cortical disturbance, you end up having the thalamic-cortical loop having more than one frequency generally. And having more than one frequency, you blend them together and you get sharp, choppy waveforms. If you ever have a chance to generate two frequencies that are close to one another, like an 8 and a 10, you'll find that it gives you a really kind of a nasty waveform with some 2 hertz stuff in it. And it's not there in the 8 hertz signal. It's not there in the 10 hertz signal. It's a beat frequency difference between the two signals, kind of like a binaural beat where you have two frequencies and you hear the difference between them. You see the same basic thing in the surface EEG. When you blend two frequencies, you get a beat frequency if there's a two frequencies that are generated and they blend in the surface. So the fusiform alpha that you see in a kid is two frequencies that aren't aren't well developed into the person's dominant frequency that they're going to end up having, and that immature thalamus ends up making more than one frequency, and they blend together and give you a choppy waveform. So that's the source of it's cortical, but again, thalamocortical, thalamic is the source of any kind of an alpha rhythm. And if you blend two frequencies, you get choppy, sharp waves, sharp and slow. I think that's largely what I've got for you. I've got I see the question and answer thing now. Nia. So that, I guess that's about what I've got. If anybody has anything, about the time we hang up is when you're going to get the question that you were trying to think of the whole time. You should feel free to email me, QEEGJAY at sbcglobal.net. And feel free to email. Anyway, I think that's what we've got. Thanks for the invite. It's always good to see old friends, and it's been too long, but I can't fly anymore at all. Not even a local flight, and they won't let me drive anymore either. You can imagine that. I can't see on one side anyway, so I wouldn't want to be driving around me anyway.
So we have to come to you, Jay, in that case.
They've actually done a few courses here at a hotel in the little tiny town I live in, and it's really a very tiny town. But it's got a hotel right next to the harbor and kind of a cute old downtown, so it's worked out fairly nicely. And it's like a 3-minute drive, so it's a appropriate distance. They can drop me off in the morning, pick me up at night, So
once when when we can travel again, to come and visit you.
Anyway, thanks for the invite, and everybody should feel free to email if they come up with a question. And thanks very much. And hopefully your students have been well funded from donations from folks.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.